For the longest time now, the simple act of staying alive has been at the core of the video game experience. This concept has now evolved to the point where we're playing entire games solely dedicated to the act of surviving against the odds. And it's become a hugely innovative and popular genre in and of itself, survival gaming.
So why do these games fascinate us? And how do we explain that when we're offered a whole multitude of different worlds to escape to, we're so drawn to the end of this one? More often than not, survival and the apocalypse tend to go hand in hand. That's not to say you can't have one without the other. For instance, Minecraft is often acknowledged as one of the games responsible for launching this latest wave of survival simulators. But at no point is there ever any mention of a story, a setting, time period, let alone the end of the world, just an endless wilderness left for us to explore. And on its own, the wilderness has been shown to be a more than powerful enough force for players to reckon with. Last year's reboot of Tomb Raider showed us that the elements can often be far more terrifying than any enemy type the game might choose to throw at us. But when it comes to bringing out the true survivalist in gamers, it certainly helps if the world is literally crumbling down around them. The Last of Us showed us that the end of the world can not only be the start of an amazing adventure, but also a stunningly beautiful video game location. In terms of gameplay, an apocalyptic world instantly grants the player permission to act on a far more primal level. And with so few laws and rules, player behaviour in these worlds can be drastically different from anything set within a normal functioning society. One of the ways these games promote such instinctual behaviour is often by isolating the player from the very beginning, leaving them feeling powerless, helpless, and alone. Starting the player out with little to no equipment, gear, or in the case of the sandbox survivor Rust, barely any clothing, survival games can quickly outline their goals and objectives, not through lengthy exposition and dialogue, but instead through what limited abilities or resources are available to the player from the beginning. Stripping a character bare also allows us to completely inhabit our survivors. The absence of any present skills, powers, or weapons creates a distinctly more personal connection, and as a result, you feel more invested in the well-being of the character and therefore will try harder to keep them alive. One of the most common ways of keeping your player alive is by learning to craft items along the way. As well as creating vital gear essential for survival, crafting also teaches in-game skills that we can reuse later on, simulating the satisfaction of learning a real-world survival skill. And as these lessons are usually self-taught, they can feel far more rewarding than simply following an on-screen prompt. When it comes to the act of travelling in survival games, it's usually long and drawn out, and covering such long distances between landmarks, often on foot, makes discovery of any sort of building or structure a surprisingly thrilling experience. Approaching any form of civilization in survival games can be very dangerous, as they usually serve as magnets for other players who are just as desperate as you might be. However, it's this very curiosity that these games rely on to create their drama and conflict. With only so much that can be obtained from nature's bounty, the temptation of better gear inside is often far too strong to resist. Trading the vast openness of the outdoors for the dark claustrophobia of the indoors is a risk that survival games regularly ask of their players, usually transitioning the game from just survival into the more traditional survival horror genre. in these situations, the fear of being alone is replaced with the fear that you may not be alone. This uneasy feeling tends to grow as players nervously gather up resources, forage for gear, all the while becoming more and more committed to keeping their survivor alive. And after so long alone in the virtual wilderness, this can start to take its toll, leading players to make rash decisions when they do finally spot someone else out there. Traditional games like to draw a clear line between friends and foes, but characters you may meet in a survival game tend to blur this line, whether they mean to or not. Placing such a strong emphasis on survival often leads to desperation, which can lead to unpredictability, which inevitably leads to danger. But like many mechanics at work in the survival genre, when things do unexpectedly go well, we the player are all the more satisfied, relieved, and grateful. This is no doubt why so many small, simple tasks feel all the more rewarding in a survival setting. Things like bandaging your wounds to keep them from becoming infected, filtering clean drinking water so as not to become sick, getting some much needed shut-eye from time to time, or even just trying to keep your sanity in check. The runaway success of DayZ was in no small part thanks to its highly detailed micromanaging of even the most trivial of survival requirements, right down to blood tests and even antibiotics.
There's just something incredibly grounding about performing such rudimentary tasks in a video game. These basic human needs are far more relatable than any explosive action or superpowers we've experienced in a game before, and therefore we create a far stronger bond with our virtual survivors.
This can be an incredibly immersive and wonderful experience when everything is going well. However, it can just as easily become a horrible, stressful nightmare when it all eventually begins to fall apart. Because no matter how safe you may think you are, survival games will rarely allow you much time to become comfortable or complacent, as there's always an ever-present risk or danger. Very rarely is much explanation required when it comes to adding these extra threats to an already threatening environment. Bandits and thieves naturally slot into a broken down society and create fear out of a lack of morality and mercy. While mutants and monsters spawn from radioactive fallout or highly infectious disease that all play into a broken world. But all of these apocalyptic antagonists pale in comparison to the real stars of the survival genre. Zombies. The perfect accompaniment to the end of the world, these wandering walkers provide the ultimate in extra motivation within a survival setting. Along with often being credited for the destruction of the world in the first place, zombies act as a sort of slow-burning catalyst that provide an ever-present threat to the player. Their endless, unstoppable nature wears down survivors, constantly putting pressure on the situation, and eventually tearing groups of survivors apart from the inside before tearing them apart for their insides. After surviving long enough in these worlds, it becomes apparent that most survival games rarely have a happy ending in sight. With permadeath becoming the ever-popular choice these days, your time with many survival games will often depend on how strong, smart, and most importantly, ruthless you can make your character. The virtual loss of permadeath is one of the largest threats made possible in the world of video games, and therefore is perfectly suited to a genre that relies on summoning such raw instincts and brutal emotions from its players. Ultimately, everything that can be found, traded, crafted, or stolen adds more value to our virtual existence, and it's the fear that it can all be lost in an instant which promotes that heightened, nervous energy that keeps us coming back for more.
So, as long as developers continue to experiment fiercely to create the genre-defining hit, and as long as we as humans remain curious about our own mortality, then survival games will only grow in popularity as the perfect simulator for this dark fascination that we all share.